You are listening to the Pedagogy Primer podcast. I'm Mark Gallimore, Director for the Center for Online Learning and Innovation at Canisius College in Buffalo, New York. This podcast is a multi-episode introduction to and exploration of teaching in higher education. Today's episode features an interview with Dr. Malini Suchak, Associate Professor in the Animal Behavior, Ecology, and Conservation Program and the Anthrozoology Program. Dr. Suchak has a wealth of experience teaching face-to-face and online courses, and here in the COLI office, we consider her a key advisor on teaching in the sciences and practical pedagogy generally. I'm here with Professor Malini Suchak, Associate Professor in the Animal Behavior and Ecology Program and the Anthrozoology Program here at Canisius College. She earned a PhD at Emory University, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention that at the baccalaureate level, she is a Canisius alumnus. Malini, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on the podcast.
So I guess we should probably start, if you could briefly describe your teaching roles at Canisius that I mentioned in passing in the past several years.
Sure. I teach at the undergraduate level in the Animal Behavior, Ecology, and Conservation Program. I teach kind of a range of courses. I teach our intro course, first semester freshmen, and then I also teach two upper level courses, so juniors and seniors. So I kind of see students beginning and end. And one of the upper level courses is also an advanced writing course, so I play that role as well. In the Anthrozoology program, I teach graduate students, and that's a mostly online program. We do typically have a little bit of face-to-face interaction each semester in the pre-COVID times, but that's been largely online. And I actually started in the graduate program as an adjunct back in 2012, which was the first year, the first cohort from that program. And then a year later, my position full-time came up. And so I applied and was selected for that. And so now this is my 8th year full-time at Canisius.
Wow. Okay. So you have extensive experience teaching both online and in the classroom. And I like asking this question when I encounter folks that have that. In what ways do these different modes inform each other in your experience?
I think that's a really interesting question. I remember back when I first started teaching in the Anthrozoology program, I was asked at Emory, I was still mostly full-time at Emory at that point. I was asked to give a seminar on online teaching because really not a lot of people were doing it. And, I think they kind of knew that it would become a thing that more people would want to get involved in. And I remember someone asked me, kind of like, what's your online teaching philosophy? Which was a really interesting question because we don't really actually talk about our teaching philosophies that much, even though I think probably we should, because that would help them inform the way we actually teach more. But it was also kind of a perplexing question because I realized that I don't have a separate philosophy, right? It's the same. The way I teach, the things I care about when I teach, they're the same, and they just manifest perhaps in slightly different ways, or I try to bring aspects of what I like about face-to-face into online and vice versa. And so a couple of key things I think stand out in terms of how the modes inform each other. I think the fact that for the most part, I've been teaching online for most of the time I've been teaching face-to-face as well, has really helped me structure my classes. So, Mark, I know you talk about pattern teaching a lot, and that's something that I really adhere to in my online courses because having that weekly pattern or biweekly pattern and having things, very regular, very predictable, that's not only good for online, that's a better structure for face-to-face. And I find that it's better for both me and the students because both of us need that predictability and that routine that comes with the way that the class is structured. So I think that's really influenced the way that I have set up a lot of my face-to-face classes, which, to be honest, made the transition a little bit easier from flipping back and forth in the last year or so. I also think about the way that I kind of try to elicit and judge participation online. It's not, I think in the face-to-face classroom, we kind of assume if the students are there and awake, they're kind of engaging with the class material. And that's maybe not, first of all, accurate, but also maybe not the best measure, but it's maybe something we could get away with. And I don't mean get away with in like a lazy sense, but it's just something that kind of works face to face, even if it's maybe not the best, that just doesn't work online because you wouldn't know that they're there. And so there's an intentionality to the way that I try to draw students out online that has really changed the way that I do it in the classroom. You know, I find that I get a lot more from individual students who maybe I wouldn't hear from in the classroom, who would just kind of blend in and I wouldn't necessarily notice that they're not asking these questions or whatever. And then all of a sudden in an online format, they are. And so that's really shifted kind of the way I try to get students to participate, you know, building in opportunities for individuals to tell me directly what they think through some, you know, short written responses or like an exit ticket type of a deal in the classroom. And then I would say like the other way around, thinking about how face-to-face teaching has informed my online teaching, a big barrier, I think a lot of people, or not barrier, maybe challenge is a better word, a lot of people find online is managing your time as an instructor. It's very easy for it to expand and fill the time that you give it. And it's very easy to be doing it at midnight or on the weekends or whenever. And, you know, when you teach Monday, Wednesday, Friday, there's a routine, and certainly you're doing stuff when you're not in the classroom, but, you know, you only get assignments. Let's say they hand them in on Mondays, you know, you would get assignments on Mondays and probably grade them throughout the week. You don't get assignments at midnight on a Saturday or something like that. And I think, you know, trying to bring some of that back into the way that I manage my online courses, you know, I go on a discussion board at the same time every week, same day, same time, in the same way that I would go to a class discussion, same day, same time. And that's when I go on and that's when I do stuff. So I think that that's kind of helped me reframe it. And I think part of that comes from the fact that I do both all the time. So if I didn't do that, I would be both in the classroom and doing all this classroom stuff all the time, and then letting, you know, online stuff bleed all over every other moment of the day. So I think it's just kind of helped me structure it as if like I teach 3 classes and each one has allocations on my calendar in the same way.
Yeah. Yeah. So you've brought some things, I should say, back, I guess, or from online into face-to-face. Focusing on face-to-face a moment, prior to COVID-19, we never seemed to have enough classroom time with students. I mean, it's almost to the point where we sort of forgotten that gripe, but we never did in our face-to-face classes. We always had more we wanted to do. Where did you leave off prior to COVID-19 in terms of classroom activities that you found most effective and that you really wanted to prioritize? You know, it's always a project for all of us. Where were you in that project?
I definitely had been shifting away from purely content delivery, right? Like cramming in more examples or more concepts or that kind of thing. Even though I think that's a very real temptation, especially the more years you teach a class. You know, I tend to teach the exact same classes every single year. So it's very easy after 8 rounds to be like, and this new example. And so I had been kind of shifting away from that and really resisting that urge for a while because I think sometimes the not enough classroom time is because we're cramming so much content in that we're not necessarily stepping back to say, what do we want to actually spend our time on? In one of my classes, I try to do a lot of simulations. It's my animal cognition class. And so I want to actually run them through cognitive tests in the same way that we test other animals. So a lot of times I'll like not give them any instructions and just put materials in front of them and they have to figure out what to do because we can't instruct an animal what to do. And sometimes I'll have them read studies and then design tests to actually test each other to figure out kind of how they would approach that. And to me, that's much more them like experiencing the material than just hearing about it. And in the class, we're often really critical about how these things are designed. And so I think it really is very humbling to kind of figure out like, okay, this is actually very hard to do well. And so I've tried to do some of it online. I've tried to do some like online simulations. Those I haven't had as much success with because I find that they're a bit more passive. You know, it's very easy to like watch a video of the experiment, but it's different than doing it yourself. So that one has been really tough, and I really can't wait for the day when we can get to a place where I can sit across from them and have them actually work with materials and, figure those things out for themselves. Another one that's coming to mind is in my writing course. I really try to make the writing a collaborative process between myself and the student, or the student with other students. They'll do their research in the classroom with me, so they can, pull up a study and we can talk about it if they don't understand what it actually means, or if they're not sure if it's actually a good fit for the argument they're trying to make. And I think aside from being rewarding, it fosters, I think, a more positive relationship with writing, which is something I know Graham in the Writing Center has talked about a lot. And, I think of this one really specific example early on of this student who I had, I think, given feedback on a draft. And one day she appeared in my office door, just kind of standing there awkwardly. And I was like, what's up? And she said, you wrote this comment about having a problem with passive voice. And I have to tell you, and I think she was like a senior at the time, she's like, I've gotten this comment so many times and I have no idea what it means.
Yeah.
And, it really was a striking moment because, here's a senior and she's saying, I don't know what this is. And for some reason in that moment, she trusted me enough to explain it. And, we went over it, and then I had her, look through a couple sentences. And once I was confident she knew what it meant, she went on her way and never had that problem again in my class. But it was an interesting moment of being like, we give a lot of feedback, but it's not a conversation, and it needs to be a conversation. So I had started doing these things that I called writing lab, where they would get a draft of a shorter paper or several shorter papers back, and I would just open it up for, let's say, 30 minutes of a 50-minute class period, and just say, pull up your work, start to revise it, call me over. And I would spend the entire time just bouncing from student to student, kind of talking about, the revisions they were making. Sometimes I could write on their papers, not sure what you mean here. Let's talk about this during a writing lab. And they would call me over and explain, and we'd talk about how to express that better. So that's something I've thought about a lot just in general, is like, how do we start these conversations and make this more of like a collaborative process overall? And I have some thoughts. This is the first semester I'm going to be doing the writing stuff more online. And I have some thoughts about what I want to try, but I'm not sure if I'm going to really be able to get to that collaborative place. And I will say it was easier for me to attend to more students when they were all in the classroom together working on it.
Yeah. It's interesting that the liberal arts are often assumed, and those of us in the liberal arts probably are smug about, we're writing intensive subjects on campus. We're where students write. But as I've seen you demonstrate to fellow faculty, and you're addressing here, writing is very important in your science classes. How does writing serve your students in your courses as sort of junior scientists, as developing scientists?
Yeah, it's interesting, right? It doesn't seem, I think we act like it's not as central to our field. But I really appreciate the foundation that the students get in English 101 or in other writing classes. And I know that they wouldn't come to me as well prepared if they weren't writing all the time in a lot of their core classes. But writing in science is kind of a specific thing, which is what makes it so intolerable for people who are not scientists to read what we write. And, even if students aren't going to become researchers and publish their work, I think exposure to that type and style of writing is really important for a lot of the things that they might go on to do, right? It's not unusual for a zookeeper or an animal care tech to write a report about an animal's welfare, or maybe they have to research literature on, enrichment in giraffes and write up recommendations for what their organization should purchase, or, something like that. And so I think being able to research, process information, and write about it is really applicable to how they might actually need to communicate when they're out in their careers. I would also say, I think writing is a really powerful tool in the science classroom. We often articulate science as a set of static facts, And then the way that we assess what the students are learning is by testing them on those facts. And science is a process. It's constantly changing. We've been exposed to that process in real time as a public over the last year. And I think that, writing allows you that space to kind of deal with the process. It's informed by the values of the people doing the science. And nothing is ever proven in science. I use that phrase all the time with my students. There's always untested variables. Everything is open to critique. Everything is open to improvement. To me, science is like a puzzle that we're constantly working on, and each finding adds a little piece to the puzzle. But right now, we don't even know what the picture of the puzzle is yet, right? Like we're still really building it. And so I think writing gives you the space to articulate those things and to really say kind of where we're at in the process and what we need and what information we don't have, and where it's failed and where it's been good. And I think the process of doing that opens up the students' understanding of what science actually is.
Yeah. So now we're in the midst of this COVID-19 era, which has really been challenging for people teaching across disciplines, right? So multimodal and students online and students in the classroom. And what's your perspective? What have you experienced, and what are you observing your colleagues experience while teaching during the COVID-19 era specifically?
Yeah, I think that I was fortunate that I did have a lot of experience online. So I know that a lot of people had challenges I didn't necessarily have, both in terms of just navigating the online environment and learning a lot of new technology. But also I really have a really solid sense of who I am as a teacher. And I know what I like and what works really well for me and well in the settings that I have. So I think I didn't experience that so much, but I am very sensitive to the fact that a lot of people have dealt with a lot of challenges in that area. I think for me, this time has really taught me a lot about teaching through trauma, both individual and collective, and really identifying priorities and setting boundaries. When everything shut down last year, everyone's world turned upside down. Like nobody was untouched by that radical, rapid change to everything in our lives.
Yeah.
But in addition to that uncertainty and the panic buying and that general fear of the unknown, for me, my next door neighbor, who is very dear to me, he passed away from COVID-19 on March 25th, 2020. And he was the second person in Erie County to pass away from the disease. He got sick from community spread before the virus was supposedly even in the area. His death was very public. It was, something that we all experienced alone because at that time we were all really strictly separated from each other. So we're experiencing this major, upending of our lives. And then I also had this just huge grief that was compounded by this terrible fear of losing loved ones because, it was like a week in and already I had lost someone. And it was just really overwhelming. And I know that I floundered at times and I kind of just had to say, okay, here's what's important, here's what's not, and I'm going to stick to that. And sometimes what was important was, especially in those early months, sitting on the porch with his widow and just kind of grieving together, or checking in with my family, making sure everyone had what they needed, making enough masks to cover an army, those became really important things. And I think this is a time that really clarified for a lot of people, what's essential in life and what's not. And my point here, it's not like I'm trying to say that my trauma was somehow worse than what everyone else was going through, because, trauma is not a competition. But just that we're in this time where everyone's experiencing extra crises that are very personal on top of our shared ones. And I think it's really difficult to keep going through all of that. And I read a quote recently about how pushing through trauma to do work is soul anguish. That was the phrase that they used. And that really resonated with me because sometimes we just can't push through, and we need to respect that in ourselves. And I think it was really interesting to me because I think a lot of times we kind of feel like we have to be invincible and just keep doing things and not interrupt what's going on for the students. But the students were so gracious when I was struggling the most, even though I think a lot of them didn't actually know what was going on. I didn't want to, scare them all with what had happened. And no one questioned if I missed something or, didn't respond to an email or anything like that. And it really made me think, if the situation was reversed, would I have been so gracious to them? I never really considered myself draconian about things, but at the same time, I feel like we're very enculturated to believe that students want to do the least possible and, lie about things and invent dead grandmothers to get out of things and, that kind of thing. And I just thought about how no one asked, no one criticized, no one, challenged me to prove the extent of my trauma, right? Like nobody did that kind of thing. And so, what harm is there to extending empathy to students, without requiring to prove what's going on in their lives? I thought about it a lot, and I think, maybe maximum 1 out of every 10 students might be lying or trying to get away with something. But if there's 9 out of 10 that benefit from that empathy without having to, show documentation or whatever it is that we're trying to require to allow them to have a little bit more flexibility, and giving that extra empathy without asking them to prove it, I think, I'll take my chances on that. 1 student gets away with something, fine, but 9 benefit. So I think, in addition to kind of just clarifying, really focusing on what's important, it just really changed the way I think about it when students are struggling, whether that struggle is visible and known to me or not.
Yeah, this seems the essence of a lot of higher education institutions' missions, including our own, based in Jesuit or Ignatian values, but other universities as well have some sort of counterpart to cura personalis, care of the whole person, and maybe we shouldn't allow a relatively small population of students who may sort of prey upon our goodwill, drive policy towards taking a kind of a less empathetic view of their lives, of students' lives as a whole.
Yeah, so, and I've also started to ask myself, like, why are we taught to believe the worst, right? Because it's all a story we make up in our head about why students are doing what they do, right? Because most of the time we don't know. And even if we ask them, a lot of times they're not comfortable telling us. So like, why are we taught to assume the worst? Because you could assume the worst or the best, and both are stories that you're writing in your head about the situation that's going on.
Yeah. Yeah, it's how this culture has sort of developed, not only in higher education, but in K-12, judging from internet memes and so on and so forth. But maybe we all need to be far more sensitive of the way we, construct those narratives in our head. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So I have to ask, turning a little bit to online, numerous people who have come in contact with the Canisius Anthrozoology program, and I would add my voice to this, have commented on how your students, graduate students, commonly at Canisius, we call that the ANZO program. So that's what that means if you hear it around campus, seem to have developed a strong sense of community as members, as students and as a community of learners. This can be a challenging thing to foster in an on-campus face-to-face program. It can be very challenging to sort of promote. And we conventionally think of it as even tougher in an online program. How do you account for ANZO's students' such strong sense of community and mutual support and enthusiasm for their programs? And I guess inevitably I'm asking, what suggestions might you have for those teaching in other online programs?
I think this is something you have to be really intentional about in online programs. Communities don't build themselves. And I'm glad that you mentioned that it's challenging to foster in an on-campus face-to-face program, because I think sometimes we mistake being together for community.
Yeah.
And I can't tell you how many times, like, I've had the students, work together on something 3/4 of the way through the semester. They form a little group next to where they're sitting. And I hear a student turn to the student next to them and say, "What's your name?" And I'm like,
Yeah.
okay, we need to go back a step and make sure people in the class know each other, right? And so I think that we probably should actually be more intentional about this in face-to-face communities as well. But that in the online program, you can't get away without doing it deliberately. And I think a select number of synchronous class meetings is really helpful. A lot of times we will offer 2 options for a synchronous class, allowing our students to split into smaller groups, which helps them get to know each other's voices a little better. We have small class sizes. I think that's something that really has to be acknowledged here. And,
Yeah.
if you want individual interaction and attention, a smaller class size is going to really facilitate that. We also do community-wide experiences. We get a speaker every semester, and it's so great because you can get speakers, especially virtually. I mean, we had a guy from Australia, which is really funny because he was coming in at like 7 a.m. and we were at 7 p.m. listening to him. But a lot of times we get the speakers to come in and we have a big public lecture, and then we'll let the students have a separate meeting at a different time where they can ask questions and really, engage with the speaker together. So we have these like very common experiences. We do a community read every year and have a discussion about it. And then we have this kind of fun round robin thing to select next year's. So I think those types of things really build that sense of camaraderie. And some of those things, I think would be beneficial in the face-to-face classroom as well. I also always make a point of meeting face-to-face, meeting individually with students each semester, usually twice. And I do that with my freshmen face-to-face as well, or I used to back in the day. And, there's no substitute for getting to know a student individually, in terms of their connectedness, I think, to you and to the program and kind of how they feel. So I guess, my suggestion for people that are teaching in similar programs would be to think about how you can build in some of those experiences. And I know one thing I always hear, like, especially about my individual meetings is, that takes an enormous amount of time. And it kind of does, but in the grand scheme of things, it actually doesn't take that much. But I think of time as trade-offs, right? And so if maybe it means I'm going to spend an hour less prepping each week, that's probably fine because that's not going to result in a noticeable difference. But that hour I'm spending with the students is going to result in a noticeable difference. So I would just really encourage people. I think we always think of things as adding, but I think some of these things where you're really connecting or you're connecting with the students with each other, think of ways to subtract things that are less meaningful and focus in on these interactions that are a little bit more meaningful. We also, our students, and they've done this kind of spontaneously over the years, but I'm sure someone could, foster this is, we have incoming cohorts that will just spontaneously develop their own group chats and things like that, where they share things of interest and they can pose questions, about stuff. And I always just make sure to mention to them, like, if it's something that needs to come to me, make sure someone that brings it to me, because I'm not going to hear it in your group chat. But, stuff that doesn't even involve us too, but that connects them with each other and helps them have, a few people that they can be in touch with, I think can be really helpful.
Yeah. Yeah.
But again, I would say, sorry, just to add, why are we not encouraging our incoming freshmen to have group chats with a handful of people in the class so they can ask questions and reach out? Why aren't we asking them to meet with us individually? Like, I think these things would actually be really helpful in person as well.
Really high impact practices. Yeah. Yeah. And you and your colleagues, I know firsthand, on occasion, helping with, or assisting with quantitative analysis or things like that. You are rigorous researchers. What do you feel is the relationship between your research, your colleagues' research, and teaching undergrads or graduate students?
So for me, I know some people are able to actually bring their research into the classroom. So maybe a topic that they're really interested in, they might have the students work on. I haven't been able to do that so much, just based on the assortment of classes I teach, even though I do research in those general areas. But I do think being an active researcher really helps me stay current. Some areas of my field are changing so rapidly. A couple of years ago, I would have probably had slides in my cognition class that said certain cognitive abilities evolved in vertebrates. And, once vertebrates split off, those abilities kind of came about, but now we have people that have found them in octopus and bumblebees and all kinds of animals. And I'm constantly finding stuff where I'm like, well, this actually isn't what we think anymore.
Yeah.
So I think, it's really important for kind of staying current. And I mean, staying current has implications beyond just the accuracy of your material. In terms of the fields that I'm in, staying current can mean that we afford certain animals protections that we didn't previously, and things like that. So I think there's really wide-ranging implications for making sure that students have up-to-date information. I would also say more generally, I think that it probably leads to an emphasis on the process of science because it is such a dynamic, changing thing. I don't necessarily want them to learn a static set of facts about the area I'm teaching about, but rather about what we know and why we know it and how we're learning more. And I suspect, at least in part of that comes from approaching the material as a researcher who, no matter what I see, I'm always thinking about what does this mean? What's next? What are the challenges for this type of work or that kind of thing? So I think it kind of shifts to like what I want the students to actually get out of the classes.
Yeah. As we're now sort of as advice on the COVID-19 pandemic or from healthcare officials, there's been this commentary about changing or evolving advice is science working rather than science, demonstrating previous failures or something to that effect. And so for students to see science as dynamic and question-driven seems to me, I know that parallels my own experience in history, where we're not a sifted accumulation of facts, rather a conversation, and questions are crucial as they evolve.
Yeah, and I'm hoping, to be honest, that this conversation that we're having about science right now will change the way that we teach it fundamentally, and maybe it will extend to other fields like history as well, because I think we've done people quite a disservice by not really emphasizing, how fields evolve and what that means. And we're seeing the very real consequences of that, where people are dismissing experts as being so-called experts or whatever phrase they want to use, just because we know more now than we did a year ago. And so we have to update what we're saying. So I don't know, probably it's overly optimistic to think it will lead to a fundamental change in education, but it sure would be nice.
We're doing our best.
Yes.
Yeah. And on that note, a chronic complaint by faculty is getting students to engage with content where we need them to have a set of facts or context, because then we want them to engage in a conversation about what they're reading or what they're watching. And it can be particularly difficult to get undergraduates to read. They're buried under distractions. I'm not sure how much that's actually changed over time. Maybe that was the case in previous generations too. And, today it's just convenient to blame mobile phones or, Netflix. But obviously ABAC involves a lot of reading. What methods do you employ to encourage students to engage meaningful with print, or for that matter, video material, getting them to watch, a half-hour video or an hour-long lecture or something to that effect?
So I often think about, I've thought about this question a lot, and I often think about like asking myself the question, what value does this add? What does doing a particular reading, watching a particular video, what value does it add to what they're getting elsewhere? So I think sometimes when we're not seeing engagement, sometimes it's genuinely like they're just not engaging with the class material at all. But I think a lot of times we provide information redundantly, right? If you assign a chapter in a textbook and then you teach that chapter in class, if I was a student, I would pick whichever one was the most straightforward for me and do that, right? I don't need to do that twice. There's no added value for doing it twice. And I think, to me, and I don't mean this, I don't mean this word in a way, probably someone will get a little defensive about it, but I think it's a very obsolete notion, this idea, because this is very common in the sciences of like, you need to pre-read the book chapter so you know what I'm going to talk about in class.
Yeah.
And you're going to pre-read this chapter, and then I'm going to essentially follow this chapter in class and teach very similar stuff. And, it's not like I'm going to ask you to have a conversation about this or anything like that. It's so you're familiar before you come to class. And to me, that's very obsolete, because even as a student, I wouldn't have done that. And to your point about phones and Netflix, I think it's much more challenging. When I was a student, if you wanted to watch TV, you had to watch it live, and you could only watch things at certain times of day, like there, it just wasn't this ever present draw. And I think it is more challenging to say, I'm going to put that away and do this other thing now. Especially, this stuff is designed to prey upon our psychology and keep us coming back and doing more. And I didn't have any of those things. And so I think about the fact that like, I didn't have those things, and yet I still wouldn't have done that reading. Right. So, and if I have something where I feel like the students aren't doing it, I ask myself why. Right. And so I just had an example in the last couple of weeks where last week, I didn't use the reading very well in class. Like I just totally forgot about what I had assigned. And normally I try to ask them like thought questions about it. So it's not like asking them to just repeat information from the reading or something like that, but how it connects to another example or what it means or why it's important or something like that. And I just, for some reason, I just forgotten. And I did the whole class. And then after class, the student actually asked me about something in the reading that he was interested in knowing more about. And I was like, oh, that thing. Yes. I'd forgotten about that reading I assigned. And it was funny because this week I found a drop off in students that had done the reading. And then I did ask them thought questions, and only a couple had done it. And so I feel like I'll swing back the next week because they'll realize that it was useful to them to have it. So to me, it's more of a reflection of kind of what I'm doing and how I'm using it than what they do. And to that end, I think a lot of it is about asking them for thoughts and information. When I have them read peer-reviewed articles, I have them do, fairly detailed, assignments that go over, the main points of the article. What was the question they were asking? What did they do? What did they find? What does it mean? And those are questions that I had a professor in graduate school that was like, if you can answer those questions about a peer-reviewed article, you understand those articles or that article. And I've told my students that, like, this is why I picked those questions. I think one of the things that happens is that requires feedback. And we are all very short on time. And the more stuff you ask them to do, the more you have to grade. Yeah. And, to me, it's worth it. And again, I'll just say, okay, well, I'm going to shave a little bit of time off of prep or off of some sort of administrative task. Or, I had a couple of years where on the reading assignments were 5 questions. I would tell them, I just randomly, I use a computer randomizer and pick 2 of the questions to grade every week. So it varies which 2 or something like that. And, I never got any complaints about that. And they always kind of came prepared. So I think a lot of it is how you ask them to use the material. And a lot of times when we're not seeing them do it, it's because they either don't have to use the material because they can use other material that you either told them in class or something like that. Or I think if the only way they're using the material is on like a test, they're very likely to fall prey to the idea that they can get it at some point and cram it before the test and spit it out then. And so they don't need to actually engage with it when you're asking them to. Yeah. So I think a lot of it is about how you structure what they actually do with it to get them to do it. And are there students who don't read? I'm sure. Do I look? No. I never get into that D2L thing to figure out, who's accessed each reading or stuff like that. And again, that's kind of I have the power to write a story in my head about why students are doing some things. And I'm just going to assume that if for some reason they're not engaging with something, there's a good reason for that. And as long as, I get enough from them to show that they're learning and engaging with the material in whatever way, I'm not going to split hairs about, them missing a reading one day or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'll sort of wrap up by asking you a really open-ended question. So where are you headed next? What are one or two things about teaching online that you would like to, or face-to-face for that matter, that you would like to somehow improve? What's your sort of the next phases you would like to tackle in teaching?
Lately, I've been thinking a lot about synthesis. I think this would be true of both online and face-to-face, but a lot of times students see each topic or each class day really in isolation, and things don't get tied together, and the bigger picture can kind of get lost a lot of times. So I've been thinking about this a lot, especially as things have moved more online and with the very limited in person. Each week we do a different topic, and then I grade everything the following week, which, pro tip, if you're on a pattern and assigning stuff weekly, grade stuff every single week so you don't, end up in a hole.
Yeah.
And what happens is when I'm grading everything, it kind of brings it all together for me. And I'll see these really interesting patterns or themes emerge from stuff that the students really keyed into. Because a lot of times when I'm grading stuff, I'll ask somewhat open-ended questions about, like, what comment or question do you have about this particular topic? Or, I'll see these like patterns emerge where like everybody had a concern about this one specific thing, or, one student will ask just like a really interesting question or something that I think just really would, is important for the field to think about. And those are things I would love to have everyone benefit from. And I experimented one year, it was several years ago, in my graduate class with having like students, or I think I did it one year, and then the next year I had students do it. Like the week after a class, someone would type up like a weekly report about the previous week, and then send it around to everyone. But it always just feels like, okay, but now we're moving on to the next week, right? Like we've moved on. That's not useful anymore. And so I'm trying to think of ways to create this synthesis and help them benefit from each other's thoughts. Because I'm seeing all kinds of really cool and interesting stuff. And I feel like it's great for me to see that, because honestly, sometimes I wouldn't have seen that in a face-to-face classroom because that student would not have volunteered that question or information. But I would like to see more of the class benefit from it. So I think that's something I'm really kind of pondering right now. And I don't have a great direction for that. I don't know if you have thoughts on how to kind of create that, but this idea of, weekly patterns is great, except that by the time I'm thinking about everything that happened last week, the class is on to the next week. So that's kind of the challenge I think I'm thinking about a lot right now.
And that's often where I find myself. I don't have a clear answer right now, but I'm sort of feeling towards how I might. I have a sense that I could probably figure out, and that's why it's worthwhile for pursuing it. And I kind of am determined myself to always be in that position for as long as I'm teaching. Identify the next sort of problem of engagement, or for that matter, problem of assessment, understanding the extent to which students are learning and how they're learning, as a continuous process.
Yeah, I think that's such an important thing, right? There's always a different problem to be working on it and working out, and to kind of keep pushing that and keep doing that throughout the entire time you're teaching. That's definitely something I resonate with a lot as well.
Yeah. Dr. Suchak, thank you so much for your generosity, insights, and perspective.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on the podcast.
Thank you for listening to the Canisius Pedagogy Primer podcast. Relevant links can be found in show notes. For more helpful resources for teaching and learning, visit www.canisius.edu/COLI, canisius.edu/COLI.